Welcome to the layer-by-layer overview of Psalm 26. A way to remember this psalm is with the phrase, I walk with integrity. Psalm 26 is a short worship liturgy that prepares a worshiper to enter into God's presence and then to respond to that experience of being in God's presence. This psalm has a structure that is both nested and symmetrical. This structure is often called a chiasm. The outer sections are, respectively, preparation for worship, and then at the end, response to the worship. Moving inward, the next sections are about separation from evil, and the middle section is the moment of worship itself. Both the preparation for worship and the response to worship are confident in tone. The first section on separation from evil is determined, as David declares his rejection of evildoers. The middle section, the worship itself, is devoted and joyous, as David dwells in God's presence, dwelling where God dwells. In the second separation from evil section, spending time in the presence of the Lord shifts David's focus, and he realizes just how dependent he is on God to be the one to separate him from the wicked when he dies. The final section, the response, returns to the confident tone of someone who has been in God's presence, who is secure, and who is prepared to bless the Lord among his people. We'll now go verse by verse through the psalm. Superscription by David. The superscription tells us that David wrote this psalm, but it gives no details about when or why. The content of the psalm suggests this is a private liturgy. The references to wicked people are likely general and do not refer to specific people or events. As with so many psalms, we must understand the covenant God made with David in order to understand the psalm itself. The covenant is what gives David confidence in this psalm. Preparation, the first section. Verse 1. Judge me, Lord, for I have walked in my integrity, and I have trusted in the Lord. I shall not waver. Legal language about judgment is mixed with language about worship. A king also served as a judge, giving verdicts among the Israelites. As he approaches the Lord, David uses legal language that recognizes that the Lord is the sovereign ruler and righteous judge over the earth. His responsibility is to judge or assess all of humanity. His verdict determines who may worship him and who will be condemned. David's good character and relationship with the Lord are what prepare him for worship, not ritual or sacrifice. He asks the Lord to judge his eligibility as a worshiper. He gives two reasons why he should be judged eligible. His character is marked by integrity, and his relationship with God is marked by trust. Integrity refers to fulfilling the requirements of the covenant, and trusting refers to depending on God alone. His worship is pure. He does not trust in other gods. This is not a plea. David has no doubt that God will judge him eligible for worship. This is the protocol for approaching God, and David is confident of his status. Indeed, in the midst of his request, it is as if his confidence bubbles over. Because I am in confidence with you, Lord, who is trustworthy, I know that I shall not waver as I walk in the ways of the covenant. This verse shows the protocol for worship. First, the worshiper must be judged as acceptable before the Lord. David asks God to give that favorable verdict. He is able to ask with confidence because he trusts the covenant between the Lord and himself, and he knows the Lord promised to care for him and his descendants after him. Verse 2. Test me, Lord, and try me. Refine my kidneys and my heart. David here turns his attention to his internal life. The topic is still favorable judgment, and David uses the images of melting ore and refining metal. The kidneys represents the inner person or emotions, and the heart represents the mind. Metal would be both tested to demonstrate its quality and refined to improve its quality, using fire to melt the ore and further heating the melted metal to burn away impurities in it. This image is often used to illustrate how God uses hardship and suffering to both reveal people's character and improve it. Worship required preparation. In the physical tabernacle, priests would wash themselves and put on sacred garments before offering their worship. Preparation for David includes a refining of his inner self, asking God to prepare him for worship. The language of testing combines favorable judgment with the image of refining. Walking in integrity did not mean a person had no need of refining. Walking in integrity meant he could be purified and found eligible to worship. Just as the priests prepared for worship outwardly by washing and wearing proper garments, David is prepared inwardly by asking God for a pure heart and mind. Verse 3, "For your loyalty is before my eyes, and I walk in your truth." David makes explicit here his confidence that he will be tested and proven acceptable, and that the Lord will refine him. His confidence is the covenant loyalty that the Lord has toward him. This is the Lord's loyalty to the covenants he made, most especially the covenant to David, in which the Lord made these promises. In 2 Samuel, "I will give you great renown, like that of the greatest men on earth. I will establish a home for my people Israel, and will plant them firmly, so that they shall dwell securely and shall tremble no more. Evil men shall not oppress them any more as in the past, ever since I appointed chieftains over my people Israel. And I will give you safety from all your enemies." These promises do not mean enemies will not exist. The promises mean the enemies will not win. These promises mean David can go out to battle with his enemies with confidence that the Lord is fighting on his behalf. And they equally mean that he can approach the Lord to worship, confident that the Lord will consider him acceptable. The image of a journey both opens and closes this first section, opening with walking in integrity in verse 1, and closing here in verse 3, with the loyalty before his eyes as his traveling companion, and truth like the path on which he is walking. Separation from evil. The first section introduced the request for favorable judgment and David's qualifications for what he has done. This next section, separation from evil, provides his qualifications in terms of what he has not done. Verse 4, "I have not sat down with deceitful people, and with hypocrites I do not go." The reverse of integrity is deceit and hypocrisy. To sit down means a person identifies with the group and is willing to join in fellowship and food with them. David has refused to identify with the deceitful. He will only walk in integrity and will not even go into the home of those who are hypocrites. His integrity is valid for both what he does do and what he does not do. Verse 5, "I have rejected the community of evildoers, and I do not sit down with wicked people." Verse 5 builds on the imagery in verse 4. To sit down with a person is to accept that person socially. David does not accept evildoers. He rejects them altogether. The deceitful and the hypocrite are here expanded to all evildoers. In public, David rejects them, and in private, he refuses to sit down with them. His integrity extends even to how he relates to the wicked. His public and private treatment are the same. The imagery of a journey may be seen to continue. The traveler explicitly avoids contact with the wicked. Worship. The preparation was done for the sake of worship itself, which is the central section. Verse 6. I wash my hands in innocence, so that I can go around your altar, Lord. All of the preparation is now summed up in the first half of verse 6. I wash my hands in innocence. Washing hands was a ritual related to a worship service. It was a way of performing ritual purification. It symbolized that the Lord had indeed judged him favorably, and that he may enter into the Lord's presence. Worship is described as going around the Lord's altar. David sometimes wore a linen ephod and may have performed some priestly functions, such as when he sacrificed animals while bringing the ark into Jerusalem. This verse most likely refers to a ritual procession around the altar, which may have become an image for the climax of worship, when the greatest intimacy with the Lord is experienced. The altar was sometimes where judges settled disputes, so the ability to go around the altar may have signaled that David had been judged eligible to worship. Verse 7. To make thanksgiving heard with a voice, and to tell all of your wonders. Worship was neither a quiet nor a passive activity for David. He gave his thanks and praise loudly, recounting the Lord's deeds for his people. Worship was intimate, and David felt close to God while actively singing and recounting the history of the Lord and his people. David probably composed this psalm when he was away from the temple, but he's remembering times of worship and perhaps reliving them in his mind. Continuing with the image of a journey, it climaxes in walking around the altar in ritual procession. This internal experience in his mind shows that he does not have a purely external religion, one that only involves doing rituals in sacred places. There are indeed external rituals, but these external practices are filled with internal meaning that is still nourishing, even long after the ritual. David can meditate on the physical process of ritual procession and worship, and experience intimacy with the Lord through that meditation. Verse 8. Lord, I love the dwelling place of your house, and the place where your presence dwells. In verse 8, David is explicit about his own role. He loves, or chooses to devote himself to, the dwelling place of the Lord's house, where the Lord is present. This declaration is intended as an expression of his devotion. The way David feels and what he intends to do come together in his attitude toward the Lord's house. 5 similar words are used here: dwelling place, house, place, presence, and dwells. The abundance of words likely represents how great his devotion is. The physical temple, or in David's day, the tabernacle, where people offered sacrifices, was the physical location where people could worship the Lord. That worship was a high point of living out the covenant with the Lord. So imagery of God's house and presence is used to express a high point in David's experience of intimacy with the Lord. Many translations use the glory of the Lord, which is best understood as his glory made known, to refer to his presence. Where God dwells on earth is where he makes himself known to humanity. It is the place where his glory is present with his people. It is everything David longs for. Separation from evil. With verse 9, we have left the central section and are continuing to the second section on separation from evil. After time in worship, David has a new orientation. He turns his focus from what he has done to what he is trusting the Lord to do. Verse 9, "Do not take away my soul with sinful people, and do not take away my life with bloodthirsty people." Preparation for worship required God to judge David acceptable in that moment. After worship, David is thinking about a greater moment of judgment when he dies. The Lord is holy and righteous, which means he will be loyal to his own people, and he will judge the wicked. David lives with sinful and wicked people. He knew he was sinful himself, but his sin pushed him toward the Lord to repent and change, rather than away from the Lord to continue rebelling. The sinful and bloodthirsty people here are those who keep rebelling without ever repenting and changing. Just as in the first half of the psalm, David reminds the Lord of his character to make his request. In the first half, he asked for the Lord's loyalty to refine him. There, David was separating himself from the wicked. Here, he asks for the Lord's judgment to remove wicked people from him. He depends on the Lord to separate him from wicked people when he dies. Verse 10, "In whose hands is wickedness, and their right hands are full of bribes." David was devoted to the dwelling place of the Lord. By contrast, those sinful and bloodthirsty people were devoted to wickedness and bribes. God's just character requires that those who continue to be wicked must leave the Lord's presence. Those who have a covenant with him, who are devoted to him, will be able to stay in his presence. This verse also hints at what David means when he says he walks in his integrity. He pursues the good of others, not wickedness, and he pursues justice, which is the opposite of bribes. His time with Israelites who were suffering, those who joined him in exile when he was escaping from Saul, would have shown him a lot about the problems people were facing. Corruption, in the form of deceit and bribery, is often mentioned in his psalms, suggesting that fighting corruption was one of David's main battles as king. Response. The final section begins in verse 11 with David's response to this time of worship. Dwelling in the Lord's presence requires first that the wicked be removed. This section describes what life is like for those who remain in God's presence. Verse 11, "But I will walk in my integrity. Redeem me and be gracious to me." Verse 11 echoes verse 1 with walking in integrity. Being in the presence of the Lord motivates David again to live in the light of his covenant with the Lord. This reflects their roles as partners in a covenant. David's covenant obligation is to walk in integrity, and the Lord's covenant obligation is to redeem and be gracious to his covenant partner. As with verse 9, David uses an imperative to call upon the Lord to act according to his character. The covenant is not a relationship that always stays the same. It requires ongoing, regular interaction. Even though the Lord promised to redeem and be gracious, David should not silently expect the Lord to keep his promise. David should ask out loud for the Lord to keep his promise. It is David's responsibility to speak, to remind the Lord of exactly what he said he would do. In declaring it out loud, David shows he is committed to the Lord's promises and purposes. Verse 12, "My foot is standing on a plain. In assemblies I shall bless the Lord." The result of fulfilling covenant obligations is security and blessing. A plain is the opposite of land that is hard to travel. It represents a path with no stumbling blocks and difficulties. If David's foot is standing on a plain, he can see far into the distance, and he is confident about where he is going. In verse 1, he was able to say with confidence that he would not waver. That confidence was rooted in this covenant relationship. After worshiping the Lord, his statement of confidence is exchanged for this image of confidence, his foot on a plain. At first, David thought of what he must do, not waver. After worship, he thinks less of what he does and more of where he is, a man standing with his foot on a plain. He implies that it is the Lord who put him in this good position. David's worship leads to renewed dependence on the Lord, which gives David greater confidence in life. David always responds to God's intervening in his life with praise by blessing the Lord among his people. This is the pattern for the godly: trouble, calling out to the Lord, receiving help, and praising him in public worship. Psalm 26 is a short meditation through an entire liturgy of worship. It starts with preparing for worship, continues through the act of worship itself, and concludes with a response to the worship. David speaks of how God purifies and accepts him for worship, how he feels intimately connected to the Lord in his presence, and how completely he depends on the Lord because of his worship. The image of a journey as David walks in integrity, avoids all wickedness, and parades around the altar, ends with a final image of stillness. His foot is secure on a plain, ready to continue with confidence. But he does not take credit for continuing on this righteous journey. Instead, he will tell of all the Lord has done in public worship. We will now read the entire psalm. By David. Judge me, Lord, for I have walked in my integrity, and I have trusted in the Lord. I shall not waver. Test me, Lord, and try me. Refine my kidneys and my heart. For your loyalty is before my eyes, and I walk in your truth. I have not sat down with deceitful people. With hypocrites I do not go. I have rejected the community of evildoers, and I do not sit down with wicked people. I wash my hands in innocence, so that I can go around your altar, Lord, to make thanksgiving heard with a voice, and to tell all of your wonders. Lord, I love the dwelling place of your house, and the place where your presence dwells. Do not take away my soul with sinful people, and do not take away my life with bloodthirsty people, in whose hands is wickedness, and their right hands are full of bribes. But I will walk in my integrity. Redeem me and be gracious to me. My foot is standing on a plain. In assemblies I shall bless the Lord. This has been the overview video for Psalm 26. Our goal in this video is to present a single, coherent interpretation of the psalm. Our exegetical issues video discusses other scholarly views, and our poetic features videos explore the distinctively poetic nature of the psalm as Hebrew poetry. Please visit us at scriptura.world to learn more. Thank you.